Okay, awesome. Cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation, our roundtable today. We are talking about the path to global accessibility, and there's been a few road bumps to getting this presentation together, but we are so glad to be able to share it with you now. Yeah. Okay, so unfortunately, we have some presenters who won't be able to join us today, but we do have an amazing lineup for you guys. I'm going to give us some time to introduce ourselves. Hello, my name is Danielle. I am a first year, now second year YLC member from California. Yeah, Vanessa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, I'm Vanessa. I'm also from California and I'm a second year member.
And then Jamie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm a second year now and I'm from Tennessee.
Awesome. And then, yeah, as we mentioned, we do have some presenters who are unable to join us today. Marina from Massachusetts. So I will be taking over her part of the presentation. I'm definitely not going to do it as well as she did, but hopefully I can do it a little bit of justice. And then Kayla, who really wanted to be a part of this presentation, but was unable to help, but she's still kind of an honorary member of this roundtable. So yeah, we are so excited to share this with you guys. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about what the YLC is, even though I know most of you already know kind of what the YLC is. But the Young Leaders Council is a group of young leaders of all abilities who bridge the gap between the student perspective and staff experience for Best Buddies International initiatives. They conceptualize, design, and execute unique initiatives that apply to all aspects of the Best Buddies ecosystem: friendship, leadership, jobs, and inclusive living. And so since a lot of you guys are a part of the YLC, you'll know that the YLC is kind of divided into different initiatives that work towards different goals. And so over the next few slides, Vanessa is going to share a little bit about some of those initiatives and what they're working to accomplish.
So the next slide.
So
the first initiative I'll talk about is the jobs initiative. I was born with mild cerebral palsy. For me, that means I am unable to drive due to a delayed reaction. The YLC conducted a survey to explore the primary mode of transportation for Best Buddies participants. We found that people with IDD relied on family and friends for their transportation needs. Based on this information, we decided to create a transportation resource. We felt it was important to educate individuals with IDD on transportation services in their area because family and friends may not always be available to provide transportation. The next initiative I'll talk about is the Mental Health and Wellness Initiative. The YLC hosted a panel to discuss the unique mental health and wellness challenges in the IDD community. For me, being born with mild cerebral palsy means I rely on a walker and a wheelchair. One of the challenges I experienced while accessing mental health services was accessibility. Unfortunately, all the offices were not accessible. From what I understand, having a ramp or an elevator is not a requirement for private practices. You may be wondering why I wanted to see a counselor from a private practice. As a future marriage and family therapist, I always dreamed of having a private practice. So I wanted to get that experience. As a result of not being able to find accessible mental health services in the private practice setting, my mom had to drive me 30 to 60 minutes away to complete those hours for my degree. The next initiative I'll talk about is the YouTube channel. One of my tasks on the YouTube initiative is to edit captions. Automated captions are great, but they're not always perfect. It's really important to check the captions. Make sure the information matches what the person is saying in the video. This helps people who can read the captions and understand the information being presented. I'll talk about the YLC accomplishments. The first accomplishment is accessibility in terms of the 5-star Friendship Walk standards. The YLC conducted a survey exploring accessibility at participants' chapters and events sponsored by Best Buddies. We found that the accessibility issues at chapters and events sponsored by Best Buddies were two completely different issues. For chapters, all participants are able to physically access the event. However, the issue arises typically during the activities. Many physically disabled individuals were having a hard time participating due to the activity, instead of having difficulties accessing the event or venue. We found that in our survey that many physically disabled participants have a wide range of difficulties when attending friendship walks due to the location chosen for the events. Based on this information, the YLC generated an accessibility project proposal outlining short-term and long-term steps to improve friendship walk accessibility standards. Following a meeting with Best Buddies International, it has been stated they will be adopting measures from our proposal. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. The YLC has secured a spot on the Best Buddies International new DE&I committee. The members of the YLC plan to utilize this opportunity to bring forth the voice of Best Buddies participants. Model UN. Model UN hosts numerous conferences throughout the year, and they have graciously invited the YLC to participate in many of them. These opportunities have allowed members of the YLC an international stage to speak out against the hardships that live within the IDD community. A few topics presented by the YLC include injustices faced by individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much for sharing about the YLC, Vanessa. And I think I skipped over this slide a little bit, so I'm going to hop back really quickly. But so Vanessa explained a few of our initiatives in a little bit more detail, but this is a complete list of all the initiatives that the YLC has, including Ambassador, Alumni, Student Advisory Board, YLC blogs. So you can see that hopefully now you have a better understanding of kind of all the broad range of goals that the YLC has whether it comes to producing media or interacting directly with some of the Best Buddies pillars. YLC really has a diverse kind of goal set, and so it's really cool. It was really cool listening to Vanessa explain a little bit about some of them in more detail. Okay, so now that you kind of have a better understanding of what the YLC is, apologies also for the little slide shifting earlier. I was trying to figure out my keyboard. But now we can move on to the main topic of the presentation, which is accessibility. And so later in the presentation, our different presenters are going to kind of go into accessibility in different avenues, but I'm going to kick off this presentation by kind of giving a broad understanding of what accessibility is, and particularly what the difference between accessibility and universal accessibility is. And so right now, those might not sound like they're different things, but hopefully you will understand that they are by the end of my part. Oh, someone in the waiting room. Okay, also I cannot see the chat, so if anyone is trying to tell me anything, feel free to unmute. So let's talk about the kind of basic definition of accessibility. Accessibility is when the needs of people with disabilities are specifically considered and products, services, and facilities are built or modified so that they can be used by people of all abilities. Oh, 2 more people in the waiting room. Let me really quickly let them in. Okay, so a lot of you might have heard the word accessibility thrown around, but you haven't considered the technical definition. And so I thought it would be helpful to kind of put that on the screen for us all to be on the same page. But yeah, this is kind of what the dictionary definition of accessibility is. And let's go to the slide. But then now we have this bigger question. What is the difference between accessibility and universal accessibility? So like I said before, it might not be clear that there's a difference between the two, but I'm going to kind of walk you guys through what the difference is and why that difference is important. Okay, so I have this graphic that I really like that I wanted to share with you guys to kind of explain what the difference between accessibility and universal accessibility is. So here we have, oops, sorry, dog in the background. So here we have some graphics, and I'm gonna name, we have these two little boys right here, and I'm gonna call this one Tom, the green one Tom, and then the blue one I'm gonna call Jerry. So Tom and Jerry want to go apple picking. So they go to their mom. They're like, let's go apple picking. We want to go apple picking. And their mom is like, okay. So then they go to the park and they decide that they're going to pick apples. So then they find this tree and it has a lot of apples in it. But as you can see, the tree is leaning in this first upper left-hand corner right here. The tree is leaning more towards Tom. And so it will be easier for Tom to get some apples. So as we can see, that represents inequality, where these two little boys who both want to pick apples, one of them has an unequal access to getting the apples or to excess opportunities. So that represents inequality. So let's move to this top right-hand corner. Now, as you can see, both Tom and Jerry now have been given ladders so that they can reach the apples easier. But as you can see, Tom is still having an easier time getting the apples because the tree is still leaning closer towards him. And Jerry, even though he has a ladder, he still can't reach the apples because it's still too high for him. And so this represents equality. And equality is when there are evenly distributed tools and assistance. So we can see that in the picture because Tom and Jerry, they were given the same size ladders, but that doesn't help that Tom can still reach the apples easier and Jerry can't. So that represents equality. So now let's move to the bottom left-hand box, which says equity. And so now we can see that Jerry was given a taller ladder so that he can now also reach the apples. And so this is a step farther than equality because now both Tom and Jerry have ladders that make sure that they can reach the apples. So they can both reach the apples. So equity is where custom tools that identify and address inequality. So we can see that it went from inequality to equality and equality to equity. So do we kind of see how each one is a step past the other? And so equity is a step forward than equality, but it's not the perfect scenario. Let's turn our eyes to the last right-hand bottom corner box, and this one is called justice. And so justice is defined as fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. So what does that mean? So now in this picture, we see that Tom and Jerry, or maybe their dad, because it'd be probably really hard for little kids to do this, but they have taken some wooden bars and some kind of rope and they fixed the tree so that it's now standing up straight. So that means that the tree itself was fixed so that Tom and Jerry can reach the apples equally. And so do we see how that's kind of an even step further than equity? So I really like this graphic because I think it explains really well kind of the step progression from inequality to equality to equity to justice. And those differences are kind of the differences between accessibility and universal accessibility. Accessibility would be the same as equity, where the needs of people with disabilities are considered and they're kind of given those accommodations. But universal accessibility would be the same as justice, where society itself is changed so that those needs would not even be considered. And I know this is all very kind of meta. I'm not giving any specific examples, so don't worry, I will be giving specific examples later on. But are we kind of on the same page? Hopefully. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to unmute. I'm happy to slow down and re-explain something. But yeah, I'm gonna get, okay. So this is a slide to just sum up what I just said. Accessibility is when the needs with people with disabilities are specifically considered. So you're kind of looking at people with disabilities specifically and asking what is it that they need. And then universal accessibility is the design of buildings, products, or environments to make them accessible to all people, regardless of age, disability, or other factors. So you're looking at everyone in an entire population and building a society that works for everyone. So now we're going to go into some examples. Okay, so example 1, our door is always open. So as you can see, we have 2 pictures. On the left, we have a picture of a woman in a wheelchair, and she's using the handicap button to open a door so that she can enter this building. And then on the right-hand side, we have this man who, believe it or not, is not using magic to open the door. It's an automatic opening door, so it senses when he comes up and it opens so that he can go in. So if we apply what we just learned, the left-hand example is an example of accessibility, where the needs of people with perhaps a physical disability are considered so that they can enter a building. But then on the right side, we have an example of universal accessibility, where anyone without a disability or anyone with a physical disability would be able to use the door to enter the building. And so do we kind of understand that difference a little bit better? I'm hoping these examples help. And I want to leave a disclaimer that I know it's not every scenario can have universal accessibility, but I'm just talking about a society that's hopefully working to apply universal accessibility in as many ways as possible. Okay, have another example. And so another example is something that we use every day. When you watch a video, an example of universal accessibility would be where there are captions, because anyone, whether you have a disability, whether you might be hard of hearing or deaf, or you don't have a disability, you would be able to watch a video because it has captioning. And so that goes back to what Vanessa was doing earlier with the YouTube initiative, where she would write automated captions and make sure that they're all correct. That was ensuring that everyone of all abilities would be able to watch and access the same videos. So that would be another example of universal accessibility. So that's kind of the rundown of accessibility versus universal accessibility. Again, please don't hesitate to let me know if you have any questions, but we're going to go ahead and move on to the next portion of the presentation.
Okay, I'll be talking about what is the history of accessibility. In 1932, In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president. He was the first U.S. president with a visible disability. He was in a wheelchair most of the time, but he often tried to hide this from the public view. If you look it up on Google, there's a lot of images that show how he tried to control his image so that it did not look like he was in a wheelchair. This is all due to stigma. People often saw people with disabilities as inferior, incapable of doing tasks that people without disabilities could do. Although it was a great step in progress that Franklin Roosevelt was elected president as someone with a disability, it was sad that he had to hide it because of the stigma. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act was passed. This prohibited discrimination in federal programs and services. So disabled activists led sit-ins and protests to help get this act passed. This is another leap of progress for the disabled community because it put into law the prohibition of discrimination, which is really, really important. In 1974, a year later, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA Act, was passed. This act allowed for non-discrimination policies in public schools, so making sure that every student has a right to education regardless of any disabilities they might have. A really big event that was super important in the disabilities rights movement is called the Capitol Crawl. This happened in March 1990. There was a huge push among different politicians and a lot of disabled activists for the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, to be passed. This act essentially would declare everyone equal under law, help make a lot of things more accessible for people with disabilities. So one of the huge demonstrations that happened to help push this law to be passed was called the Capitol Crawl. Basically, a lot of disabled and non-disabled activists showed up to the Capitol in Washington, D.C. They showed just how inaccessible the stairs out front were. This was a bigger metaphor for their push to make spaces more accessible, making the country more accessible. If you Google Capitol Crawl, one of the images you will see is a disabled activist climbing up the stairs, showing just how difficult it is for some people with certain disabilities to do certain things without reasonable accommodations. So this caught a lot of media attention and ultimately led to the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. In essence, this law prohibits discrimination based on disability in employment, services rendered by the state and local government, places of public accommodation, transportation, and telecommunication services. Businesses were mandated to provide reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities. Public services could no longer deny services to people with disabilities. They are expected to have modifications to make accessibility They're expected to have modifications to make accessibility more common. Their mandate for adaptive services for people with disabilities. So essentially, a lot of the accommodations we see today, such as hallways, needed to be a certain width so that wheelchairs can get through. Buildings need to have elevators. The ADA is an act to research more about because it has been so pivotal in the fight for disability rights. Next slide. Next, I'll be talking about what does accessibility look like in the classroom. These 9 tips come from conversations we had with Best Buddies participants with disabilities and their experience and things they feel would help them and others. Tip number 1, have your members fill out a survey with their accessibility needs. This will help you plan ahead, which is really important. It's good for you to be proactive. Get all your members' information if they're comfortable sharing their accessibility needs. This will help you plan your events ahead of time. This will also help you make sure those needs are taken into account. It's also easier than having to plan right before the event. So if your members are comfortable sharing, definitely try to get that information. One of the things the audience might not know about me is that I have cerebral palsy. I use a wheelchair and a walker, so I understand that it might be uncomfortable to ask for these accessibility accommodations because you don't want to be a burden to your school or event or anything like that. One thing I have learned from the Young Leaders Council is by sharing my story, I do not only help myself with the accessibility I need to socialize with my peers. Sharing my story helps others. Tip number 2, for out-of-school events and outings, make sure you look at the venue ahead of time. If you see someone sitting by themselves, go sit with them. More often than not, individuals with cerebral palsy and mobility devices are sitting by themselves because there is a barrier preventing them from socializing, like grass or not enough space between rows in a classroom. Tip number 3, talk to your advisor ahead of time to make sure you're not forgetting anything. Tip number 4, have multiple ways to communicate event logistics ahead of time. Tip number 5, have someone translate messages and communications home in other languages. This is really important because when we're talking about accessibility, we're not just talking about with disabilities, we're talking about language as well. Making sure that all members and their families can access your communication is super important. For example, if you're sending home a flyer, have someone in your school who is a foreign language teacher translate it. Send that translated flyer home to the member and their family. This is a really easy way to make sure everyone is truly included, that your events are accessible for all. Tip number 6, have captions for videos that you show or have an ASL interpreter at the event. When I was in school, I had a classmate who communicated through ASL. Our teacher taught us sign language. I know that the student enjoyed every opportunity she had to talk to us directly instead of through an interpreter. Personally, I love learning new things every day, so learning ASL was a really neat experience and a skill I have been able to use throughout life. Tip number 7, use large print for any forms or PowerPoint presentations. This is helpful for people who have visual disabilities and cannot see super small print, because it's also just helpful for everyone. When you see large print, it stands out to you more. It's easy to read. Like many of these tips, they're not just helpful for people with disabilities, they are helpful for everyone. When you make your events more accessible for people with disabilities, you're actually making them more accessible for the group. So this is something super easy that you can do that is going to make everyone's experience a whole lot easier and better. Tip number 8, have a sensory-friendly option or room at the event and be mindful of sensory conditions, avoiding flashing lights or strobe lights. Be mindful of how loud the music is. Flashing lights and strobe lights can be really overwhelming for some people. They also can induce seizures for people who have epilepsy. So maybe just try to avoid those. You can still have a fun dance party without using flashing lights or strobe lights. It will still be a great experience for everyone. Also, when playing music, be mindful of how loud the music is. Being mindful of where the speaker is located. Having options where people can dance and participate without being super close to loud music or bright lights. And tip number 9, for games and activities, explain the instructions verbally and have a written or printed copy available for members to read. For more information on these tips, I highly encourage everyone to subscribe to the Best Buddies YLC YouTube channel and check out the video on ways you can make your events more accessible.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing those accessibility tips, Vanessa. Okay, so our next portion of the presentation is, what does accessibility look like in city planning? And this was Marina's portion that I'm going to be taking over. So again, not doing it as well as she did, but I am reading from her script, which is amazing. So there we go. Okay. Imagine you are making your way to the city, specifically the city of Champions or Boston, for the first time ever. You feel the excitement trickle down your spine as you picture the skyscrapers and their glowing lights blaring in your face as you make your way down the crowded streets. But now, imagine you are in a wheelchair, and you remember Boston is a colonial city with many cobblestone streets. You struggle to get enough momentum to continue on with your friends down the cobblestone, and when you finally get moving, you risk falling over. You now live with the constant fear of tipping your wheelchair over day to day. Imagine you and your friends finally make it to the parking garage after a night out where your car is parked, but you realize the space is too tight for you to squeeze through. Now you must ask your friends to help carry you in. For Mia Palm, a University of Massachusetts Amherst student, this is life. Focusing strictly on the city of Boston, I want to bring to light some of its inaccessible aspects. The crosswalk leading from the Boston Commons, which is a famous, beautiful public park in downtown, to the front gate of the Capitol building, or the home of the state government, has no ramp and a sign that literally says, "Welcome to the State House. Watch your step on the curb and tread carefully on the uneven bricks." This restricts anyone with a physical disability affecting mobility from experiencing these city landmarks. In addition to that, not all MBTA stops are accessible, and even the famous hop on hop off tours, like the duck boats, which give tourists an in-depth view of the city, have a third of their locations inaccessible. Boston is a city with amazing history, but with that comes outdated architecture and building structures. Many streets are extremely narrow and uneven with brick or cobblestone. This means wheelchair users or anyone who uses mobility aids are not able to easily experience the rich culture strictly because of their disability. I recently read a story about a Bostonian named Michael Moehi. He is a wheelchair user and struggles to get his wheelchair up the curbs of the city. He says that many times he is forced to just roll along the street since he cannot get up on the sidewalk, and drivers will honk and tell him to get out of the way. He had a great quote in the article that read, "Disability itself isn't a problem. It's the systems like sidewalks and other things that are a problem when they're not accepting disability as a common natural life occurrence that it is." And it is true, because in Boston, it has been 30 years since the Americans with Disability Act was approved by a federal judge. This was a settlement in which the city of Boston promised to ensure all curb ramps meet ADA specifications. As of now, less than half of the city's curb ramps currently meet that standard. Let me repeat that. As of now, less than half of the city's curb ramps meet that standard. Recently, Michael Moehi actually fought with the city and has gotten the city to give an extra $25 million to improve the curb ramps throughout the city. They are now hoping to be completed by 2030. This fight is the start to an all-embracing community. Along with this good news, Boston has already begun its promise and funded and hired its first ADA coordinator who is focused on street capital movements. The city also expanded investment in and oversight of sidewalk and curb ramp construction projects and has included $57 million and a $25 million increase, thanks to Michael, to meet its construction obligations under the proposed settlement in its recently passed 5-year capital plan. Additionally, the city started its survey and transition plan to ensure all ramps are brought into ADA compliance. And this is not just in Boston, but many cities across the world are similar, where they have barriers that make living in the city extraordinarily difficult for those with a disability. These include blocked wheelchair ramps, buildings with no elevators or escalators, public bathrooms which are difficult to navigate and make it to, and stores with no step-free access, and more. More change is coming, and fortunately enough, in cities around the world, people are recognizing the need for inclusiveness, especially since soon enough 15% of city livers will need accommodations for a disability. These changes include many, but I want to highlight a few quick examples. Seattle has a sidewalk making map called Access Map, which gives users the opportunity to enter their desired destination, and in return, the user will receive different routes describing uphill, downhill paths. It also tells the user where larger curbs will be, as well as paved pathways in the case of the use of an assisted device. It uses a green and red system to categorize the streets into flat and hilly areas, making grounds with a slope of over 10%, which is usually the limit for those in wheelchairs, red. In the future, it is hoping to achieve the addition of pavement width and location of handrails too. In Singapore, they have a goal of making the city inclusive throughout its building and architecture. Singapore has created low concierge counters and column-free spaces in the majority of the establishments in their central business district. They have also put induction loops, braille directions, and pictographs in all their transportation systems. In Sonoma, a city in California, architects have created a project to promote a sense of calm in this bustling city. Their intent is to reduce anxiety for those hypersensitive to sound, light, and movement. The designs for structures are very simple and unornamented, and noise is reduced through quiet heating and ventilation. The natural light and reduction of stimulation that Sonoma has incorporated into its communities has allowed many more people with a sensitivity to bustling cities the ability to move in and create a successful life there. Though these are all amazing initiatives and a great start to an all-embracing world, there is still a lot left to do for our future. Many people do not realize all the little things that make living in a city with a disability much harder. As a society, we take for granted how easily some of us can transport around. And as one kind, we must make changes and start now. Everyone whose destiny is brought to city deserves to freely access all parts of it and be given the platform to become the best version of themselves there. And these were the examples of how different cities that are working to create a more inclusive living environment. Awesome. So yeah, that was Marina's portion of the presentation about accessibility in the city planning. Like I said, it's pretty amazing. It's really disappointing that she wouldn't be able to be here, but I'm also so glad that you guys still get to hear it. Now we're going to move to Jamie's part of the presentation, which is accessibility in the workforce.
Okay. So you want me to just go ahead and start?
Go for it, Jamie.
Do you know that 81% of adults with intellectual developmental disabilities do not have a job in their community? I was one of them. It took me a long time looking for a job, maybe close to a year without a job. I was bored at home and I needed a schedule to follow and stuff to do. I went to a bunch of interviews to keep looking online. I tried everything. Did you know that only 19% of people with disabilities are employed? I am one of them. Being employed makes me have a schedule to follow, things to do, and some money to save. It makes me feel like I have something to do and not just sitting around waiting to find something to do. It helps me be independent, like I'm moving out soon. It helps me to meet new people. Having a job is good for your brain and helps you not to be bored at home. As much as I'm fortunate to be employed, one of the things I'm not a fan of is Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. People with disabilities are legally allowed to be paid below minimum wage. Submission wage is allowed under Section 14C, which is meant to encourage employees to hire certain individuals that are impaired by physical or mental disabilities, so they don't lose out in employment opportunities. The current federal wage is $11, which means workers with disabilities can be paid any amount less than that. According to 2020, the minimum wage report that the U.S. Department of Labor and Law estimates that 100,000 people with disabilities are employed at places that are paying them less than minimum wage. Based on 2018 census data, less than 40 million people with disabilities live in USA, which makes up 12% of the total population. And in 2018, only 35% of people with disabilities are employed. The report also reveals that between 2017 and 2018, the average wage of a person with a disability is $11 per hour, working on an average 16-hour week. That adds up to $53.44 per week, and is $213.44 a month. The solution President Biden Build Back Better bill gives people with disabilities to make at least minimum wage.
I was born with mild cerebral palsy. One common misconception is being diagnosed with CP means the entire brain is damaged. This is not true. For me, cerebral palsy impacts my ability to walk. As a result, I rely on mobility devices such as a walker for short distances and a wheelchair for long distances. For me, being born with mild cerebral palsy also means I'm unable to drive due to a delayed reaction. As a result, I take the bus to get from point A to point B. A one-way trip is a half an hour for pickup and a 1.5 hour for drop-off. In other words, 2 hours one way and 4 hours round trip. For the past 10 years, I have been submitting resumes and participating in interviews. I have a bachelor's, a master's, and a lot of volunteer experience. I have learned it doesn't matter how much education or volunteer experience I have. What I really need is someone who is going to see beyond my walker and wheelchair and give me a chance. The pandemic taught us that many jobs can be done at home. I truly believe one of the ways we can close the unemployment gap for people with disabilities is by offering remote employment opportunities. For the past year, I have been working with the YLC to make this possible. I am proud to announce that I am no longer unemployed. I have been gainfully employed since Monday, May 16th, 2022. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thanks so much for sharing, Jamie and Vanessa. And Vanessa, congratulations on your employment. We are also happy for you. And thank you everyone for listening to our presentation on the path to global accessibility. We really hope that you took a lot away from this presentation. And we do have a little bit of time left, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And if anyone has any questions, now would be the time to ask them. Stephanie, I see your hand is up.
Hi everyone.
Hi, Stephanie.
Oh my god, this presentation was incredible. I would love to use this for my city council. Like I would love to bring this to my equity, diversity, and inclusion advisory committee. Like I would love to bring this to them. Like
We're so glad to hear that you enjoyed it, Stephanie. We'd love to talk to you about possibly bringing this presentation to your city council.
I think this is important to my council as well, though, because I'm part of the equity, diversity, and inclusion advisory committee here in Niagara, and I would love to bring this up to our city council because I think it's just like this would get their attention, because I think it's just like we have a lot to discuss. Like we're still struggling to figure out like how to bring this about to pre-pandemic things, like when we're trying to find the road back. Like I would love to bring this presentation up to my council and be like, see, look at all this. Like this is amazing. Like this is something that I would love to just have them see, that there are other people just like me that have a bigger vision of to bring this back together better and stronger. Like
yeah, I completely agree, Stephanie.
Like I'm still having trouble with employment myself. Like I'm still waiting for an employment job, and it seems like it's taking forever, but I'm still trying to hold on there.
Yeah, I think Vanessa can definitely contribute to this as well, but it's a really long process, but we completely believe in you and support you, and you're gonna make it one day, Stephanie. We know you will.
Like if I can bring this presentation out to my Niagara City Council to just show them that this presentation, I think this would also help to contribute to our workforce plan as well. Like if I had this, like this would bring another thing that I could use to show that that we have a plan. Like we could have another plan going forward from COVID to pre-pandemic things, and getting our build back together, a stronger plan together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is definitely something we can talk about after the call as well, Stephanie. So why don't we save this for after the call? We can talk about bringing it to your city council. And right now I see that Ryan has a question, and then after that, Margot. Ryan, go ahead.
Yes, so first, I want to say thank you for sharing the presentation with us tonight. I first saw the presentation a few weeks ago when I was at Panera Bread up here in Elyria, right before my dad and I was on the road going to the Best Buddies Friendship Walk here in Ohio in Columbus. And I did ask the same question a few weeks ago. How long did you all create the presentation? How long did you all brainstorm ideas on creating the accessibility presentation? Because I know it's something that it didn't happen overnight, because especially working with projects like the accessibility, it takes time and it takes all the work, because I'm one of the Best Buddies YLC alumni, and that when I was in the Young Leaders Council, it takes a lot of work to brainstorm ideas and turning them into action and into reality. So how long did you all create it to the accessibility presentation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, Vanessa, did you want to take a jab at
I was
that?
going to say that that's a great question, Ryan. I would argue that we've been working on accessibility since day one, since for the entire year on the council. I mean, it started with our 10 tips that Sophie and I gathered from the participants with the YouTube channel. And then we got invited to the MUN accessibility, MUN Impact to present. And also Garrett's been a huge advocate, and he did the 5-star standards for the Friendship Walk to improve Friendship Walk accessibility. So it's been ongoing.
Yeah, and I think you're so right, Ryan, that it did not happen overnight, even though I wish things like this could happen overnight. But we've been working on this for, I think Garrett reached out to us sometime last year, and we've kind of just been having meetings every now and then, and it's just putting our parts of the presentation together. And I think Jamie, Vanessa, and Marina all did such amazing jobs in their accessibility in a specific field. And I think a lot of it too is just having a good team and having good communication that allowed us, because we didn't meet as frequently as we might have wanted to, just because our schedules didn't align as much. But having good team members and having good communication allowed that process to move a lot more smoothly. Yeah, thanks for the
I will
question.
add that I could not have asked for a better group. Just to see everyone's passion for accessibility in different ways, this presentation just blows my mind. I love giving it every time we get an opportunity, and it sounds like we're gonna have even more opportunities. So that's just amazing. It's something I would have never dreamed of, that it reached this far.
I agree. We worked really hard on it, and we love presenting it to you all. And hopefully, once it's recorded, I think if it's okay with Garrett and our YLC team, I can probably send it to Mayor Brown.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something to talk about after the meeting is over. Margot, did you have a question?
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to bump off the passion real quick. I think you guys did an incredible job. I really loved seeing all of the areas that you all were passionate about when it comes to accessibility. Ryan, accessibility is an ongoing conversation. It is not one that you can just lay to bed when you're going to bed at night. And I think you could agree with that. I know I could agree with that. I know everyone on Zoom tonight can agree with that. So yeah, seeing your guys' passion with this presentation was really awesome.
Okay, awesome. Does anyone have any more questions?
I think Ryan might.
Ryan, was that hand from before? Okay.
I forgot to take it down.
It's okay.
But
it
I can ask a quick question. You know, for future reference, how can presentations like the accessibility can go further into generations after generations?
Well, I think we just have to like spread the word out and let everybody know about it.
That is such a loaded question, Ryan, and such a good question too. And I feel like one of the hardest parts about presentations like this is we can talk about accessibility and talk about how important it is for hours and hours on end, but it won't actually be useful until we kind of turn it into action. And I think that's why I love the way that this presentation was formatted, because we had kind of specific examples of accessibility in different scenarios. Like Vanessa talked about it in the classroom, Jamie talked about it in the workforce, Marina had it in city planning. And so I like that there are these kind of very tangible examples of how to apply it to the real world. And so, yeah, I also love that Stephanie and Jamie are potentially bringing this presentation into kind of like city council. And so I think that's a step forward of how we can apply it to real life. And then once those are applied, like it's going to move forward into the generations after us, which will be really, really cool.
Yes, I think it's a great idea because it also brings into self-advocacy, because I know today I was on a different car with the Cuyahoga County Board of Disabilities of here in Cleveland, and they were talking about self-advocacy, learning about getting involved around your communities, like helping the homeless people, and also getting to know around your community, like having community engagements, like working with a job or volunteering around the community, and recognizing those people with IDD or without IDD in the LGBT community, and by getting to know everyone and accepting one and another.
Mm-hmm. Completely agree with that, Ryan. Okay, and then Margot, do you have one more thing to say before we log off?
Yeah, so
I have my hand up also, by the way.
Oh, I just saw it. Sorry, Jada.
go ahead,
You'll
Jada.
be after. Oh, go ahead.
All right. So I had a question. And my question is, what was when it comes to making a project pertaining things like accessibility, what are some of the obstacles that you guys had while doing this project in terms of just finding info on accessibility, and was it triggering to some of you, because I know a couple of you are disabled yourself, and so did it motivate you to just share your experience better and share ways better, or was it kind of a hindrance? These are just things I want to know.
That's a great question, Jada. I can't speak for everyone on the presentation, but like for me, it was fairly easy because I had started this conversation even before I joined the YLC. And so, and just seeing the importance of like sharing everything I shared tonight as much as I can, so that accessibility standards do get improved from Best Buddies International and just anywhere and everywhere, honestly, not just Best Buddies, but beyond that. I don't know if that necessarily answers your question.
And I think there's always going to be something a little bit discouraging about doing these presentations, or at least not doing them, but when you're starting out on them and you're kind of like realizing how inaccessible our society can be, it's always like, oh, like what can our presentation really do? There's a lot of like self-doubt. But I think what really helps me through that, and I know we already talked about this, is the people that I'm working with, because it's just like, look at these people who are so passionate about the cause and just such genuine and good people to begin with. That just remind me like this presentation is something that's worth doing. But yeah, I don't know. Jamie, do you have anything to say?
I just hope like we get the word out, and a lot of job like managers hire people like us, and based on the info, like for people with disabilities, you gotta like be thankful for the job you have, because a lot of employees might not hire you, which is really sad, because they'll like judge you on a disability and they don't think you'll work as hard as you will. So it's like makes you work harder and be thankful for your job every day.
That was really well put, Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Also, thank you, Ryan.
Yes, you're welcome, Jada. And Jamie, I could not agree with you more because I tell you what, because I don't know what to say, because, and I don't mean to brag too, but ever since I got the job at a brush above at a pet grooming salon, I had no idea that I was gonna get hired at the pet salon after I was being offered a job, because my first thought was is that, okay, what's this job is going to be like? What's the employer is going to be like? Is he or she is going to understand me, base it on my IDD, and there were like all these questions going through these angst about going through on what the job was going to be for me. But ever since I walked it in and got my first interview with the pets grooming salon, I was like, wow, this person wants to hire me. They fully understand where I was coming from, and they just say, okay, let's hire Ryan, and we're gonna work with him. And I tell you what, I just don't know what to say. That I'm very thankful, because no other job out there will not do that. It's hit or miss. It's hit or miss. That you gotta find the right job, the right person, and that's all it matters. That's all it matters.
Yeah. My job at Publix is really great. That we have 2 people who are on the autism spectrum, and I'm good friends with them, and they take good care of us, and they make sure we're doing okay, and that's really great. It makes your job work harder, and you have a good team that helps you out.
Yes, I miss going to Publix, because I used to go Publix when I used to live in Florida, and I would live across the block on going to Publix. I miss those Publix subs, those chicken tender subs.
They are good.
Yes.
I think one thing I will add is that the YLC has been super supportive. So I think that really helps me personally with this accessibility presentation. If they weren't supportive, or if I was in an unsupportive environment, then putting this presentation probably together would have been harder. But as you saw tonight, like I shared a lot of my story, and that's just because of the YLC and how amazing they are. So, and that's nothing I've ever done before, and before I joined the YLC. So, yeah.
I do know it's nighttime in some places. It's only 6:30 for California, but I know it's like 9:30 for East Coasters. So I don't want to hold us off for too long. But Margot, do you want to have the last word?
Sure. Last word. Why is that a Margot thing? Anyway, accessibility is talked a lot about at my job as well. And I service many different kinds of people, regardless if they're like me and all of us with IDD. And I also service people that have without. And I've come to just realize that, accessibility is just that middle conversation. Because yes, we're benefited from it, but the whole world is too. And I think that a presentation like this and continued conversations out in the world, I think will just make the realization of accessibility much better.
Couldn't have put it better myself, Margot. Okay, with that, I'm going to end the recording.